Yeah, so for the book talk part, I'm going to focus on book's main arguments. Yeah, so basically, let me kind of say that I'm going to introduce my work on South Korean advertising. So this work started quite some time ago as a PhD dissertation project and culminated in a book which came out in 2022. So this is a book, and you have the cover on the screen. Actually, I got a lot of compliments on the cover. I think Howard University Press people did a pretty amazing job with that. So for the talk part, I'm going to focus on the book's main arguments and basically primarily talk about stuff that happens in the introduction. And I'm happy to expand on chapters and detail like any of kind of ethnographic chapters during the Q&A. So that's kind of my plan for today. So my book, Flow of Capitalism, South Korean Advertising at the Crossroads, is about contests around South Korean advertising in the first decade of the 21st century. On the one hand, I am theorizing advertising as a local social institution, not a global industry or a universal medium. I'm also arguing against scholarship that automatically reduces advertising to its marketing functions, which I see as missing important opportunities for critique and possibly political interventions. On the other hand, the book is also about South Korean capitalism and democracy in the first decade of the new millennium, because at the time, advertising became a focal point for many contests over expanding corporate freedoms in economic and public spheres. So let me set up these points with a story of one advertising campaign from 2009, which appears in one of my chapters. Sorry, let me try to get it on the screen here. Oh, sorry, just a moment. Sorry, somehow my file disappeared. Okay, I'm just going to go into talk it through since it disappeared. So the campaign appeared in 2009 and had several humorous episodes, which all illustrated some good event happening, and then the protagonist says, wow, and then something more interesting happening, and then the protagonist says, ole. So I put storyboard of one of the episodes on the screen, but I would like to share with you several episodes, and hopefully it all works. So let me play some of them, and hopefully, can you hear the sound?
Wow.
No, we cannot hear the sound.
No? Okay, sorry.
Perhaps when you share your screen, then you can, there is one box you can tag where you can share.
Let me try. Sorry, I'm just gonna have all kinds of technical problems suddenly.
Oh, really?
Like my computer is not cooperating, and yes.
Take your time. That's so everybody is happy, peacefully eating breakfast. So you
Okay.
can, no.
So would you actually mind if I kind of pause for like 3 minutes to get things going?
Yes.
Because somehow my main computer I lost my stuff.
Yeah, no worries. Take your time. But Andrew, you said there was some voice?
Yeah, there's like a sound effects.
but there wasn't all music. We don't know how much sound is in the video.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, also when, yeah.
Just a moment. Okay, so should work now. So to share sound, I see. So let me start from the beginning and let me show you several episodes. Hear it?
Yes.
Wow.
최고의 감탄사 올레!
Wow.
최고의 감탄사 올레!
One more.
Wow.
최고의 감탄사 올레!
Okay, so you get the picture. And by the way, I collected all the ads I'm mentioning in the book in this YouTube channel I created. I could share it in the link. So if anyone wants to look at it, like basically, or if anyone wants to teach it, it's like it's all there. So I put another storyboard of another version. So basically, you get the picture. At the time, KT, the company that ran those commercials, suffered from a reputation of obsolete, clunky, government-associated corporation. And with this campaign, they wanted to create a fresh image for leadership and in technology and entertainment. KT's advertising agency, Samsung-affiliated Telecommunications, created these ads, and overall there are 9. And basically, it's kind of the same formula. Positive event, wow, something even more positive, and then like, ole. Yeah. So the campaign was super popular. Exclamation, ole made it to television programs, everyday conversations. You could kind of hear it in the streets in Seoul when people were kind of joking. When they wanted to say that something was super positive, they would say, ole. So many netizens reposted ole ads on their web pages, and it was at the time before social media, so everyone kind of had blogs, and some people would collect all those ole ads. Also, amateur parodies and imitations begin to circulate. At the end of 2009, a public opinion poll found this to be the second most memorable campaign of the year. So overall, reception was very positive, but the ads were also criticized for belittling women and eroding family values. So you saw the Golden Axe episode, and this summer camp is another one that was controversial. So quasi-government media watchdog Korea Communication Standards Commission received complaints about the campaign, but it ruled that the campaign was just humorous and those offended were too sensitive. Complaints about the KT Ole ads were also received by influential feminist non-government organization Women Link, like Yosong Minuhe in Korean. But Women Link hesitated to interfere. And here I quote Ms. Na, an articulate Korea activist in her 30s who I was interviewing around that time as the controversy was unfolding. So she said, at our organization, we thought that there was a problem with the campaign, but we also thought, don't we need to recognize the freedom of expression even in advertising these days? Even though we thought there was a problem, we had no intention to address it ourselves. Her question, don't we need to recognize the freedom of expression even in advertising these days, was an allusion to a recent decision by Korea's constitutional court, which ruled for the first time in Korea that advertising was included in constitutional guarantees of freedom of expression. So until that point, advertising was considered marketing speech and basically had no special protection. The decision was a culmination of the big business lobby pushing for deregulation of advertising and mass media. Before this constitutional court decision, every single commercial on national terrestrial channels had to pass a pre-clearance by a quasi-government committee before it could be aired. In fact, that kind of amount of advertising censorship would started my interest in Korean advertising. It was when I learned about that for the first time, I was really impressed and surprised at the amount of effort that went into pre-screening of, well, all advertising that showed on national TV. However, all that came to an end in August 2008 when Constitutional Court found this practice to be, well, unconstitutional censorship. After that decision, no centralized body pre-cleared advertising. So the critics of the Katie Ole campaign said that it would not have passed the old review system and lamented new lax advertising standards. But regular audience members were unconcerned about advertisers' freedoms and kept complaining. So many women link supporters, for example, called their office demanding, often angrily, that the feminists do something about this campaign. And that's kind of what our conversation with Ms. Na was about. So after about a month of those calls, Women Link publicly demanded that KT stop the campaign. KT responded that that was unfeasible, but promised to consider Women Link's critiques in the future. In response, Women Link went on the national television, NBC, to announce a boycott of KT until the advertising campaign is stopped. There is no information available how many people participated in the boycott, but a week after the boycott announcement, KT withdrew the ad. The story had a continuation. In about 6 months, KT ran a new advertising campaign whose theme was challenging outdated norms with the slogan, "Turn the usual way upside down." The campaign episodes mocked the usual way, such as that all middle-aged women have the same perm for hairstyle, and that office workers order the same cheapest dish, jjajangmyeon, if the boss is treating. Significantly, one of the ads was promoting women's equality by ridiculing the patriarchal norm that only women cook for the traditional holidays, such as Lunar New Year. So I have screenshots from that commercial on the screen. Similar to the first campaign, KT ads assumed fun, entertaining tone, but the critical message and the call to change discriminatory traditions practically acknowledged the demands by Women Link and other critics who wanted advertising to promote progressive values. So the KT controversy reveals some of the typical contests over advertising and related dilemmas in post-millennial Korea. At their core, there is a tension between advertising being a private medium in a sense of being paid for by advertisers to advance their interests, but also advertising being a public medium in a sense of its public circulation and its purported influence on social norms and public morals. Also, the controversy illustrates how trajectories of advertising campaigns are not controlled by advertisers, but are shaped by complex and contingent negotiations with general public, which importantly exceeds target consumers and includes anyone exposed to the ad and inclined to react to it, including by complaining to authorities or NGOs. Finally, the controversy also illustrates what Korean advertising often is, opportunistic and entertaining. But it also illustrates what Korean advertising is wanted to be by many, a medium for positive social interventions that creatively promote desirable values such as gender equality. And also what this episode shows that there are cultural and institutional resources to impose such a vision on advertising and advertisers. So my book, Flower of Capitalism, South Korean Advertising at a Crossroads, is a multi-sided ethnography of those conflicting claims from audience members, advertisers, NGOs, regulatory institutions, but also advertising makers and mass media. Claims on advertising and visions for advertising in South Korea. Advertising is a ubiquitous part of contemporary life, and in a sense, all of us are experts on advertising because we just experience it in every day. And what I'm arguing in the book is that this pervasiveness lulls observers, both sympathetic and critical, into accepting advertising obviousness and the inevitability of its current configuration. What I argue in the book is that how advertising fits into social fabric is neither natural, nor thematic, nor obvious, nor universal. It is ongoing local contests, such as the one I just examined with the Katie Ole story, that define what advertising says, who gets to control it, and where that control begins and ends. So here I have like two big guiding questions for the book on the screen. The first set of questions deals with how advertising in its concrete local configurations is shaped by macro and micro struggles among advertisers, public, media, governments, and other actors. What is the social contract that governs advertising, and when and how is it negotiated? Specifically for South Korean advertising, and that's the second set of questions, I explored how advertising ended up drawn into the realm of democratic accountability to a degree unimaginable in many other late capitalist countries, and how it ended up an unlikely domain where the expansion of corporate freedoms met tenacious opposition despite neoliberal hegemony. So the book also offers a window on political, economic, and cultural struggles constitutive of South Korean democracy and capitalism as they were refracted in the clash of advertising's perceived public obligations and expanding freedoms in the late 2000s. So the book is based on 14 months of multi-sided ethnography in 2009, 2010. In the course of that fieldwork, I worked as an intern at an advertising agency, sat on the meetings of an advertising censorship board, Korea Communication Standard Commission. I also followed advertising controversies such as Katie Ole one and many other ones. Also interviewed professionals and regular people about their relations with advertising. I'm framing this work as a critical anthropology of advertising. Critical because my starting point are Marxist approaches which elucidate how advertising is deployed for capitalist accumulation and reproduction. So in the book, I'm talking a little bit about commodity fetishism, commodity aesthetics, like all those important arguments for my analysis. But I particularly emphasize the political economic effects of commercial media depending on advertising revenues, so that big advertisers end up shaping media content and ultimately confining public debate to pro-big business perspectives. The anthropology part comes in to account for how these structural forces are refracted through local context and reshaped by local history of advertising and in general. Also, to ethnographically show that particular actors' agendas rarely neatly map into their vested interests. For example, left-wing progressive feminists of Women Link might temporarily suspend their feminist priorities and respect the right-wing values of freedom to advertise in certain circumstances. So that's kind of the Katie Ole example illustrate that really well. Anthropological commitments also play out in how the book challenges the universalism associated with advertising. What I mean is that there is a fascination with cultural differences as revealed in advertising texts. Like what's culturally appropriate in one place would be culturally inappropriate in another, so kind of things like that. But having said that, there is like a tendency to universalize the particular notion of advertising as a social institution, to universalize and normalize the historical advertising structures that have developed actually from a very specific, very particular historical context of forced mass production in North America and Western Europe. In South Korea, actually, modern advertising developed not out of a need to sell mass-produced commodities, as it did in the United States, for example. Instead, in South Korea, modern advertising was championed by local eccentrics because they were drawn to advertising as a sign of modernity. Also, a big impetus was technological developments in the mass media. So there was like no need to advertise, but there was a technology for advertising. So some people were drawn to it to try to do it because, you know, modernity, advertising, and that's kind of how it developed. Early on, it was actually difficult to convince Korean companies to advertise. Like I'm talking about 60s, 70s. Many companies treated advertising like a ritualistic expense around holidays, such as Christmas. And that frustrated a lot entrepreneurial Americans who were trying to set up advertising agencies in South Korea at the time. Actually, some pretty hilarious memoirs which talk about how it's basically trying to sell advertising in Korea is very frustrating endeavor. So the point I'm making is that how advertising became integrated into South Korean life was not an inevitable automatic consequence of its capitalist functions, nor was it mere emulation of how the advertising industry developed in the United States, but something worked out over time in response to local needs and local struggles, with considerable cultural debate and historical contingencies playing a role also. So I capture these notions and expectations of advertising as cultural logic of advertising. I use cultural logic in an anthropological sense. Okay, sorry, kind of behind my slides here. I use cultural logic in an anthropological sense as a normative, common sense ideal about how something should be. Cultural logic is agreed upon in theory, but then negotiated and compromised against practical situational logic of concrete situations and interests. So for example, like it's cultural logic that students should do all homework and read everything, but you know, when it actually comes to doing it, all kinds of considerations come into picture. So kind of tension between cultural logic and practical situations. To avoid possible misunderstandings, the origins of this cultural logic are not in some mysterious innate cultural traits, but in concrete historical events. Cultural logic is an outcome of local struggles over advertising among advertisers, governments, consumers, and mass media. So I emphasize in my explanation of this logic, it's basically historical, and I certainly can elaborate on that during Q&A just to talk about specific historical developments that shape that cultural logic in South Korea. I bring up cultural logic to distinguish it from advertising's capitalist logic, which is the usual focus of critical scholarship on advertising. The capitalist logic of advertising dictates that advertising, first of all, sells commodities and advances the material interests of advertisers. Cultural logic does not erase the commercial purposes of advertising, but it creates additional expectations, which might coincide or run counter to that capitalist logic. And that's where it gets interesting. So what I discovered is that the cultural logic of South Korean advertising downplayed the marketing purposes of advertising and privileged advertising potential for public service, both with advertising messages and advertising revenues. In public discourse in Korea, the commercial functions of advertising are often subordinated to so-called public interest, 공공의 이익 or 공익, which is generally understood as the interest of middle-class consumer, and ironically, often contrasted to the interests of big companies, like biggest advertisers. These orientations were often expressed via the cliched metaphor for advertising, flower of capitalism, like chabonjoekot. So in Korea, it comes with very positive connotations, and it's kind of neutral metaphor. It appears in articles about advertising, and floral patterns are actually common on advertising-related publications. The typical rhetorical work of this metaphor is to remind the audience of the flowery, kind of pretty public interest potential of advertising, either to praise advertising at hand for realizing it or critique it for failure to do so. So the flower of capitalism metaphor asserts the cultural logic of South Korean advertising. Having said that, on the surface, the mainstream of South Korean advertising carries very few traces of those public commitments. I mean, these ads are from the time of my fieldwork, but things are pretty much similar now. The majority of South Korean advertising are pretty much formulaic campaigns that announce the advertised commodity, include a celebrity to testify to its prestige. To repeat, cultural logics are ideals. They are often considered to practical situations and immediate interests. Where cultural logic does visibly manifest is in public praise for advertising campaigns which rely on sentimental aesthetic and promote wholesome values, such as human dignity, filial love, compassion, and so on. Like in the book where I talk about advertising content, I have like many examples of such advertisements. And again, if someone brings it up during Q&A, I'm happy to show you some of those ads, which are super sweet, super sentimental, like kind of promote all those humanistic values. So there is actually a fair share of such campaigns, primarily from big companies who do it as kind of corporate image campaigns. Yeah, and again, I can talk more about that. The cultural logic also manifests in unusually restrictive advertising controls. Excuse me. So for example, advertising is still regulated pretty tightly, even though now like those pre-clearance was canceled. There are many other regulations that prescribe many rules of what advertising can and cannot say. There are legal obstacles for immediate dealings between advertisers and terrestrial broadcasters, and also some restrictions on in-program advertising. So the ideal of publicness also animated extensive advertising-focused activism by consumers and media organizations such as Women Link. Actually, one of the kind of puzzles of my fieldwork is there are always some kind of controversies arising during advertising when I was doing my research, and I couldn't tell, is it just I'm noticing that because I'm doing research on advertising, or is it actually objective fact of life that kind of people get worked up about problematic advertising and are willing to kind of protest, complain, organize, do something? I still not entirely sure if it's kind of objective fact of life, but it seems to me it kind of is, that people tend to take advertising more critically in Korea. Okay, so by putting flower of capitalism in the title of the book, I deployed the flower of capitalism metaphor both literally and critically. I wanted to foreground the link between advertising and capitalism, something that is surprisingly frequently lost in the discussions of advertising in South Korea. At the same time, I hope that the strangeness of this metaphor in English helps to denaturalize the habitual assumptions about advertising and unearth critical openings which are barred when advertising as a social institution is reduced to its instrumental ends, such as like selling commodities or marketing things. So my book develops a set of arguments about how advertising is a contested local social institution shaped in the interplay of capitalist, cultural, and situational logics. These arguments are substantiated with multi-level analysis, macro, micro, and actually quite a bit in between, of how concrete configuration of South Korean advertising were fought over by corporations, audiences, activists, and other vested interests in the first decade of the 21st century. So here I have a table of contents, and like the book comprises one historical chapter where I'm basically explaining how that cultural logic of advertising came to be, and then 4 ethnographic chapters. So I'm talking about in chapter 2 about advertising practitioners, how they kind of fascinated with this dream, with this idea of advertising that promotes public good, but somehow in reality end up doing very banal campaigns which they themselves are not particularly proud of. So kind of ethnographic glimpses of that. I have a chapter about advertising censorship and how advertising censors kind of weigh considerations for freedom of advertising and also those old residual ideas of advertising as a medium for public good. In chapter 4, I'm talking about how regular Korean people respond to advertising, like which campaigns are popular, how people sometimes are ironic about advertising, how they often like to read advertising as kind of discourse that promotes desirable values. Like you got a little bit a glimpse of that in my discussion of Kitty Ole campaign. And finally, in chapter 5, I have this extended case study of a consumer activist group which did something which might seem very strange outside of Korea. So they tried to channel advertising flows to shift Korean political landscape. So basically, they were demanding that Korean corporations spend their advertising budgets equally between conservative and progressive press. So they were arguing because they are consumers, they have the right to tell corporations how to spend their money, how to spend their advertising money. So the chapter kind of traces those arguments and how that whole activist campaign panned out. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. It's been just about half hour of me talking and open the floor for Q&A. How does that sound?